January 17, 1913. Somewhere in northern Antarctic territory, a single man has crawled into a crevasse waiting to die. He tried to climb up and fell. So this is the end. The man was thinking, I'm going to die right here. He was approximately 160 kilometers from civilization. And worst, 2 of his companions died few weeks ago. He was alone. Who is this man? And what is he doing out in this weather? The man was an Australian geologist and explorer who led an expedition known as the Far East Party to explore the Antarctic coast south of Australia. We will tell you the story of the expedition and the choices that marked it, and the men that took part in it. But first know this. Within the play Julius Caesar, Cassius says to Brutus, "Men at some time are masters of their fates." The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. That articulation suggests that we as people are responsible for our choices and, hence, for our prospects. The most important skill that an individual can develop in his life is the ability to make choices. There are stories from all over the world about the choices made by great men in extraordinary conditions, and one of the greatest of all is about Douglas Mawson and the choices he made. Sir Douglas Mawson, 5 May 1882, 14 October 1958, was an Australian geologist, Antarctic explorer, and researcher. At the side were Old Amundsen, Robert Hawke Scott, and Sir Ernest Shackleton. He was a key pioneer amid the courageous age of Antarctic investigation. He was born in Great Britain and came to Australia as an infant. He completed degrees in mining building and topography at the College of Sydney. As his very first mature choice, in 1905, he chose himself as a speaker in petrology and mineralogy at the College of Adelaide. Afterward, he made continuously choices for his aims and life ahead. He had the ambition to explore the Antarctic, so he became a part of Shackleton's Nimrod Explorer, 1907 to 1909, with his guide, Edgeworth David. They were a part of the expedition's northern party, and Mawson reached both the South Magnetic Pole and climbed Mount Erebus for the first time in history. After this expedition, Douglas Mawson led an expedition known as the Far East Party to explore the Antarctic coast south of Australia. In November 1912, he set out to explore what would afterward be known as King George V Land, with 2 companions, 3 sleds, and a group of dogs. By late 1912, as summer returned to the Antarctic, he had to part with his companions into a few sledding groups, with the point of mapping as much of the obscure continent surface as he could from the bases at Commonwealth Bay. His group trekked into the Antarctic, mapping the edges of the zones explored by Robert Scott. Over a few weeks in December 1912, Douglas Mawson and his companions, a British officer called Belgrave Ninnis and a Swiss ski winner called Xavier Mertz, had worked their way to a remote post 500 kilometers from base camp. On 14 December, they were crossing an intensely creviced field with Mertz at the front, himself at the middle, and Ninnis at the back. Ninnis was with a sled that had the most dogs and most of the team supplies. During the crossing, Douglas observed Mertz making a sign up ahead that something abnormal had happened at the back. He coordinated with his look to the back of their group, where Ninnis ought to have been. But instead, he was not. Ninnis and his sled had fallen into a crevasse. They could only see the back end of the sled staying out of the ground, and they could hear a dog whimpering, but they couldn't see or hear Ninnis. They took turns inclining over the edge of the crevasse and calling their companion. For 3 hours they called ceaselessly, but no reply came back. With Ninnis and his sled gone, the remaining 2 figured out that they had a week and a half's worth of food remaining. More than 500 kilometers from the base, they chose to turn back. In any case, they needed to get back to Commonwealth Bay by mid-January 1913. Or else they will miss the departure of the Aurora, the ship that could get them back to Australia. Their mugs and eating utensils had been placed in Ninnis's sled. So Mertz and Mawson utilized the little tins, into which they had stuffed their supplies, and carved temporary spoons from the bits of a broken sled. It wasn't long before they ran out of food and had to resort to eating their dogs. On more than one occasion, they had to eat their sled dogs, picking the slower, weaker ones to maintain enough energy to continue on their journey. First, George, the weakest of the dogs, was slaughtered so that his meat could feed both men and remaining dogs. The meat was cooked on the top of the aluminum cooker and was voted great, even though it had a solid, smelly taste and was so stringy that it might not be suitably chewed. Both Mawson and Metz became sick after doing so. What they may not have figured out was that they had been gradually poisoning themselves, because dogs' livers contain poisonous levels of vitamin A. Metz and Mawson endured extraordinary fatigue, and their hair began falling out. By 7 January, Metz was very sick and could not eat or drink without any assistance. He endured rough seizures and episodes of craziness. Before long, he fell into a fever and passed out in his sleep. He never woke up. Mawson proceeded alone. To survive the hardships of winter in Antarctica and the perils of his journey at times, Mawson had to focus all of his thoughts and his energy on surviving and making it back to his loved ones in Australia. As he continued, he became weak from hunger, and his body felt the toll this trip was taking on him. His hands and fingers were raw and sore from pulling the sled and climbing. His mucous membranes were drying up, he had no saliva, and felt that his body was rotting from lack of nourishment. In his journal he wrote, "My whole body is apparently rotting from want of proper nourishment. Frost-bitten fingertips, festering, the mucous membrane of nose gone, saliva glands of mouth refusing duty, skin coming off the whole body." 160 miles from Commonwealth Bay, he fell into a crevasse. He felt that death was imminent as he sat there huddled in that crevasse. The rope pulling the sled had been cut and sliced by sharp rocks, and he was afraid it would fall into the crevasse, taking him with it. After eating a few chocolates to regain some vigor, he creeped out and crafted a rope stepladder and tied himself to it in case he fell into another crevasse, which he did a few times. At the beginning of February, he found a supply cache named Aladdin's Cave, a place where the explorers stored food and rested before continuing on their journey. Mawson found food, but not the crampons he needed for climbing. Crampons are spiked accessories used to give traction when climbing over ice and snow. Since there were none stored in the cave, he made some of his own out of nails and wood. He was very good at creating tools to help him on his journey, including a compass and a device used to track distance. Inside the cave, he also found pineapples and oranges, signs that somebody had been there recently, somebody that could only come with the ship Aurora. It was clear that the ship had returned to Antarctica with provisions, but did it leave? The bliss of fresh fruits and provisions was short-lived as a snow squall set in and halted him moving towards his base camp. He was stuck in the cave for 5 days. When the winds had subsided, he made his way towards the base. As he got close to the shore, he saw a wisp of smoke on the skyline. Looking for a clue as to where the smoke came from, something on the horizon to the northwest caught his eye, and his knees gave in, and he went down. It looked like the Aurora. By the time Mawson made it back to Cape Denison, on February 8, he found out that he had only missed the ship going home to Australia by about 5 hours. He had arrived late for the vessel that is supposed to have taken him home. Because of this, he had to spend the winter in Antarctica, since the ice prevented sea travel until the spring thaw. There were 5 men left at Cape Denison to survive the winter. The frigid temperatures, lack of food, and limited daylight hours made it difficult to stay focused on the task at hand. They maintained contact with the outside world through radio signals until the radio operator was overcome with madness and resigned his post. Another member of the party took over manning the radio. Tempers flared up, and several times the men tried to kill each other. It was hard to maintain sanity during such conditions. Douglas Mawson returned home as a respected man by all who knew him. He was knighted by King George V at Buckingham Palace and died in 1958, known as one of the first pioneers of Antarctic exploration. Many Antarctic landmarks today bear the names of the explorers on that expedition, like Mawson Peninsula, Mertz Glacier, and Ninnis Glacier.